Welcome down the line. I'm Christine Williams, coming up for discussion on our Viewpoints Hour. Condemnation flying over the Lockerbie bombers' pomp and ceremony welcome home to Libya. A group of lawyers calling our federal court judges too old for the bench, and concern over the deportation of a blind Polish granny. Stay tuned. And these are the issues we're presenting today to our Viewpoints guests for commentary. The release of the Lockerbie bomber. British business executives made no secret of business negotiations with Libya, which had demanded his return in exchange for multi-billion-dollar oil contracts. Now, with accusations flying, the British government is vigorously defending itself. A major stir in our federal court system. A group of lawyers made waves when they called into question the legitimacy of the judges saying they're too old for the bench. And many Canadians upset over the deportation of a 69-year-old blind Polish granny. She blamed an unscrupulous immigration consultant for advising her to file a failed refugee claim. Now let's meet our Viewpoints guests. Stuart Parker is co-founder of the Toronto Democracy Initiative. He's also a lecturer at the University of Toronto and a former leader of the BC Green Party. And Robert Metz is also joining us. He is president of the Freedom Party of Ontario. And you, the viewer, you are our third guest. Feel free to join in at any time with any of your comments about any of the subject matters we're talking about today. Now, the first subject matter that we're addressing, it's a bit complex, and we're looking at very many angles of this particular story. So feel free to call in with any of those comments. And the Lockerbie bomber is it. That's been seen on the news all over YouTube, and what you might be aware of is the outrage over this pomp and ceremony celebration when he went back home to Libya. Now, this man was received as if he was some kind of a royalty coming home at last. But there's a lot of controversy surrounding this as to why was he released. Now, according to news report, we're being told that the reason was because he is in the last stages of cancer, so it was on compassionate grounds. But on the other hand, when you read more and you look at the scandals circulating in Britain, it's being said that it more had to do with the business of things, the multi-billion-dollar contracts with Libya over oil. Now, before we talk to both of our guests on this and hear what your opinions are, we have a clip, if we have that ready to show you, and this depicts what this Lockerbie bomber faced when going back home to his homeland. Take a look at it now on your screen. There it is, a welcome home. Take a look at that. Wow. Now, this really looks like a celebration of a hero coming back home. Now, Libya, according to these articles here, very much the way they do business, they combine the politics and the business. So again, I'm reiterating, there was no secret involved in the negotiations that was taking place before his release. So we're going to be discussing here, first of all, when you look at that celebration over a man that he was single-handedly pointed out as being the sole person in this case where a lot of people lost their lives in that Pan Am when that Pan Am went down. Was it appalling to you to see that welcome home, first of all? And I'm going to start with you on this one, Stuart.
Well, I think any rational person would be outraged that somebody is getting that kind of reception after committing such a heinous act. I think there's no question about that. Now, one of the things that's unclear, however, is we don't really have a sense of the level of popular appeal of this homecoming in Libya. What we have a sense of is a dictator who's been in power for a long time, who is trying to shore up his support with an extremist constituency in Libya, a constituency that he embodied back in the Cold War. But of course, you know, he's gotten old, he's gotten soft, he's had to make deals with the West. You know, Osama bin Laden and the like are far more appealing to Libyan extremists today. So what we have here is not so much a popular upwelling of support for the Lockerbie bomber. What we have is a leader once again trying to say, sure, I've begged to be let back in by America, but I'm still on the cutting edge of terrorism, extremism, and what Libya used to be known for back in the 80s when I was growing up. And I think that that's a lot of the angle that we're missing here. We're so focused on outrage in Britain, and we've got a really clear picture of what's gone on in Britain. Once again, Gordon Brown does not have the oily charisma of Tony Blair to pull off these really outrageous things. And so everybody's focused on the weakness of Gordon Brown. But I think what this really points to is the weakness of Muammar al-Gaddafi. Here is a guy who's willing to put all kinds of economic development initiatives on the line to hold back major investments in his country for 9 months because he wants Britain to sell him a symbol of what a hard ass he used to be. And to me, that suggests a regime that is far less secure than we in the West are perhaps thinking right now, and a regime that is desperate to tap into that extremist intolerance that might be in danger of bringing it down the way Gaddafi came to power in the first place.
Okay, Robert, your position on this?
I think Stuart has captured a lot of what I would have had to say, and certainly answered the question of what value would a dying person in his last 3 months of life be to anybody in terms of, you know, the whole symbolism of it. And I think Stuart explained that perfectly. I think from our point of view, quote, the West, I think there's a different issue, and I think that's letting the person go in the first place, which I think was a tremendous act of injustice. I would call it morally outrageous. I would call it morally obscene without question. The fact that, you know, that they're saying that now there's a debate whether was he really released over the oil situation and the business dealings, or was he released over issues of compassion? And a lot of the defenses coming out now are, well, it's compassion, because that was why the cancer came in so handy, to be able to release him now. And that to me is extremely misplaced compassion. I think a lot of what passes for compassion is just another form of injustice inverted. When you show compassion towards a person like that, what are you saying about the victims, about the innocent people? That's where justice really originates. It's not about punishing the guilty, it's about, you know, honoring the innocent and the people who've been hurt.
Now, in casual dialogue, you're given the feeling that it's questionable. Britain is now scrambling to defend itself, saying that this was about compassion. But at the same time, though, and I'm quoting here, Lord Trefgarny, the chairman of the Libyan British Business Council, he said outright that this illness basically only paved the way for his release, that discussions were underway long before that, that Libya wanted this man's release in exchange for billions of dollars worth of oil business. And in another article that we also gave to the two of you, you're looking at retail sales as well. Libya is seen now as a huge potential business partner, billions of dollars, imagine that. So on one hand, we hear an argument, did it have to do with the oil? But on the other hand, in reading these articles, it seems obvious, in fact, overt, that that did play a role somehow, and that negotiations were in fact taking place, and that they didn't even try to hide the fact that such negotiations were taking place. So why try to do it now? In fact, Tony Blair went so far, according to this article, to send out a letter to Libya saying, be discreet in how he's received back home. And of course, as it turned out, it ended up backfiring.
Well,
does it not concern you, the secrecy or the...
Well, it's the most perfunctory denial. I don't think any intelligent person thinks this was about compassion as opposed to oil. Obviously, it's about oil. And, you know, I have to say, I feel just mildly vindicated as a leftist in that Tony Blair was always about the oil. I didn't believe him when he said Iraq wasn't about the oil, and why would I believe him when he says this isn't about the oil? The British Labour Party is very interested in oil, just as British Conservatives are when they're in power. That's always been a priority. The British Empire had a lot of the Middle East oil, it lost a lot of it, and it works hard to control a lot of it. And to suggest that this sort of compassion fig leaf, if people got let out of prison because they'd gotten really sick in prison, everything would already be different, right? We would have the streets full of people who had just made the transition to full-blown AIDS
from prison. Good point.
So obviously, this is like saying, oh no, this polonium just somehow got into this guy's blood. It's a it's a denial that is being made because it's pro forma, not because there's any real expectation that anyone will believe it. They have to vehemently insist that it wasn't about this, but everybody knows this was about oil, pure and simple.
You could argue anything's about oil, all trade in the Mideast. I've heard Afghanistan is about oil, and even though they don't have oil. So everybody makes that argument. You could even, you know, the U.S. has been involved in all sorts of wars around the world. Everybody says it's about oil, and yet if you look at most of the wars, most of them are not.
And I want to return to that. Is it about the oil? I mean, that could represent for us a full hour show down the road. Is it about the oil? But before we proceed, I'm going to go to you, Rashid, on line 4. Hi, Rashid. You're on the line.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good. I just had 2 points. If this person was released from prison, well, if it was really due to compassion and this kind of thing, and there was no other reason, I think they should have just executed him. He's a mass murderer. He doesn't deserve compassion. Where was his compassion for the people he murdered? Secondly, if it was really about this oil, then I don't think the British government or whoever masterminded this is any better than those people who were celebrating for him when he arrived there in Libya.
Rashid, I must say you bring up an excellent point. In looking at this story, there are going to be those that are disappointed, saying it seems to be clear from the reports that Britain knew full well and has been in negotiations for some time concerning the multi-billion-dollar contracts. There are again going to be those saying, what about ethics when it comes to business? And that's an area I want to address. Rashid, I want to thank you for calling in. Once again, our lines are open for you to call in. We'd love to hear from you. Don't be shy. We're going to go for a break. We'll return after this. Don't go away. Hello again. Welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line, continuing to talk about the Lockerbie bombers' release. Once again, our lines are open to hear your opinions on the subject. Now, we heard what Rashid said on the line there, that when you look at the British approach to this, if they could be implicated on the oil issue, which, according to these reports here, these negotiations have been going on for some time, so it does seem that way clearly, then they're just as bad as the people you see in Libya. And I want to hear if the two of you agree with this even remotely, first of all. I'm going to start with you on this one, Robert.
Well, you know, when you're dealing with, you know, have you ever watched the British comedy series, Yes, Minister? Been around, I think they've shot them all in the 80s, and they addressed this issue square on target in one episode. And it was a very funny episode where British MPs went to the Mideast to do business. And in the Mideast, bribes were common, but you didn't talk about that in Britain. And everybody was handing around bribes as though, you know, it was no business. You know, that was normal business there. And there was this, they did it humorously, of course, and they had this dichotomy between the way business was practiced in the West and in the East. And you know, we think we can just come in with our own values into countries that don't share those values, and we think we can carry on business in the same way as we've been used to. That's what I think is the greater issue here. Oil is just one of many commodities we trade with other nations, and those might be nations with which we have differences of political opinion. And so what happens is certain countries tend to breach their agreements, breach their trade agreements, and that begins a chain of events that leads us down the path that we're into now. But basically, I think trying to equate the two standards of the West and East, if we're going to deal with quote-unquote criminals, we have to almost behave a little bit like them if we're going to do that to any degree. And that's why I think we might be walking into the businessmen, the executives who want to have all these things going on so they can make a deal with the devil, really, is what I'm suggesting in the longer term. And of course, there's some...
Do you think it's anything new, Robert? Do you really think that deal with the devil philosophy of business, do you think it's really anything new?
No, what's new is capitalism and not having to deal with the devil, and two people gaining by the transaction and not one person imposing force on the other. That's where I see the major difference of this century as opposed to past centuries. That part of the world, other parts of the world, they're living in the past, not in the future.
Okay, Stuart.
Okay, well this is, I mean, this is great. This is like reading a 19th century encyclopedia. There is the West, which is not corrupt, which is the future, and there's the East, which is corrupt, which is the past. But the reality is, I mean, I watched Jean Chrétien and Team Canada touring around the world in the 90s. I watched, you know, we watched David Emerson cross the floor so that his corporation's business deals could continue to function with the new government under Stephen Harper. The idea that people are not making personal deals on the side just because we're in a capitalist state. The fact is, the free market is in no way a shield against bribery or anything else, right? Everything has a commodified, quantified value. And I think what's interesting here is we have sold out far bigger things. What we've done, and I really should say the British government, because I really hope the Canadian government would do better, they've sold the last 3 months of a criminal's sentence. I think when one looks at the kind of silence that we have tolerated over things like Tiananmen Square, the kinds of moves that we have made that have been far more ethically egregious, you know, the kinds of leaders that we have dealt with, be they in Latin America, be they in Southeast Asia, there's a very long track record of governments here taking positions that are really ethically problematic in order to keep that money moving. And what we have here, what is exceptional about this case, is the sale of a symbol of an individual who's not that actually significant beyond his symbolic value, compared with, okay, let's pretend that the Armenians are not in danger and not accept them as refugees. Let's ignore this country's refugees because we want to pretend it's a democracy and it's not genocidal. I think that we make far more dangerous and ethically problematic decisions that affect the lives of hundreds or thousands than the Lockerbie bombing case. I think that people are outraged about Lockerbie because Gaddafi is a great villain, and this case is something that took place in the domain of symbol rather than in the real lives of refugees or political prisoners or dissidents who we make deals about all the time. They did in the past,
even in Canada.
But
and the families of those same people have actually come forth and expressed outrage, according to these articles here.
Well, absolutely, and obviously, but I'm not one of the fans of this theory of victims' rights, where you bring any dead people back by making sure that someone suffers more in the last 3 months of their life than less. I find this release disgusting and ethically wrong, but I think that the reality is the damage was done the day of the bombing. Those people were killed the day of the bombing.
I think there was great damage done on the day of the release and of this thing that you just called unethical yourself, and then you say you tolerate it, and you're comparing different damages, which I think are not relevant to the debate.
I would suggest that preventing death in the present is a higher goal than avenging death in the past. I think both things are things we should do.
Presented to us, I would agree, but it hasn't been presented that way.
No,
nor
because
is there any such
because nobody's death is being prevented in the present. I was just suggesting that in my ethical hierarchy, the release of this guy is bad, but it's not the most atrocious thing we've done for trade in the past 10 years by a very long shot.
Okay, now I'm gonna ask the two of you how you feel about how the West does business when it comes to capitalism. You hear one side saying that it's always about the oil and that America is corrupted, this is nothing new, and you hear the other side saying, well, no, America doesn't do this kind of a thing. We're ethically superior compared to the way they may do business in Africa or the Middle East. For example, Libya actually has the largest proven oil reserves in Africa, 42 billion barrels. That's what this country has here. So obviously, it seems to be that Britain has gotten caught with its pants down. But there are those that are going to say, well, I'm really disappointed. This is ethically disgusting, what's being done, because what's in essence happened is that there's a trade that happened between a terrorist and billions of dollars in oil. And the question is, Robert, I'm going to start with you. When it comes to the business of capitalism, is this something that surprises you?
Governments are not involved in business. Governments are
governments. Well, they've been negotiating.
Governments either, capitalism is not about honest people or dishonest people. It's about a system that naturally arises when people are able to behave rationally and consensually. Those are the conditions you have to have in order to have capitalism. To the degree that those conditions do not exist, then you don't have capitalism. You have some other form of ism, whether it's socialism, fascism, whatever, you can name it. But basically, capitalism is the only system that places the individual above the government in terms of individual rights. It doesn't mean the individual can do anything to any other individual. Anti-fraud laws are capitalistic by their nature. You know, the whole idea of consent and not forcing people to do things. It's a separation of state and economics, really, is what capitalism is.
Well, it should be. You're talking a pure form of capitalism here.
Well, there are no other forms. Any other form is not capitalism. And
okay,
that's
so
the problem,
you're saying that the West, that North America, you're saying that North America is not capitalist.
No, we're a mixed economy.
What would you call it? Mixed economy, that's correct.
That's
correct. Stuart?
Well, it's kind of reminiscent of talking to the Trotskyites in the NDP. They'll say, no, there's nothing wrong with socialism because we've never had it. I think we have to. I would suggest that their arguments about the purity of a system are largely identical to your arguments about the purity of capitalism, that it's this ideal that we've never quite reached. The reality is that in every state that has claimed to be capitalist, the government is a major economic actor, and it uses its military, it uses its diplomacy, and it uses its tax system in order to facilitate these ends. Well, then, what is the point of a term that doesn't apply to anything in the real world?
Well, I'm willing to wear
the failures of governments that tried to live up to the ideas of socialism, called themselves socialists, and let us down.
Okay,
and those governments are still socialists.
We've cast a lot of light on the whole issue of capitalism and mixed economies, but I don't want to turn this question into a debate over semantics. So I'll ask you in another way, Robert. When you look at the way North America does business, there are those that will say it's a wicked economy, it preys on the blood of international folk takes advantage of the Middle East.
Who says that?
Plunders it
Who
was.
says that?
Left-wing people, and I don't want, bingo you said. I don't like categorizing people 100% like this, but for simplicity, yes, we often categorize left, right, center, and there is a division. There's a dichotomy between left and right. And you do find people that have a tilt to the left that will
I'll
say
give you an example
that
of
we are a corrupted economy, like anywhere else.
In my daily life, I'll give you an example, two examples of capitalist life and socialist life. When I walk into a grocery store or into a variety store, I give the man $1, he gives me $1 exchange, we both walk our ways, nobody used a gun, nobody used force, nobody said they had to do anything. That's capitalism. When I get my invoice from the government called, in my city, London Hydro, part of the hydro bill, I have to pay a debt retirement charge, I have to pay a delivery charge. Even if I have $2 of consumption, I still have to pay $50 to that government to pay off their debts because a government has passed a piece of legislation forcing me to do that. There's nothing capitalistic about that in any way, shape, or form. Now, to mix those two things I just mixed and call that one system, and say this system is corrupt. Well, which side is corrupt? When you mix black and white, it's the black side that we regard the dark, the evil, that spoils the light. And that's how it works. That's why, and you can't mix the two. You can't be calling a mixed economy capitalist. Why don't people ever call a mixed economy socialist if it's mixed? You ever ask yourself that?
All the time. Libertarians routinely refer to France as a socialist economy. All kinds of places where the vast majority of transactions are voluntary are routinely accused of socialism.
Yeah, but
the Obama administration's health plan, in which 3/4 of the plan would still be through voluntary transactions with the private sector, is called socialist.
Yes.
So the fact is that this label of referring to the mixed as socialist is highly problematic and frequent. So I think the real question...
Do you hear in the States a lot, or just in France?
Excuse me?
Well, you said libertarians call France socialist, but do they call America socialist?
Yes, they do. If you listen to the people at the public meetings right now, that's exactly what they're saying. They're saying socialism has descended on America.
Because of the healthcare debate, mostly.
Right.
Were it not for that.
And the bailouts. And the bailouts.
Oh, well, whatever it is, the point is that if we get invested in this argument about purity and what to label it, I think we're missing something quite important, which is how the reality is that the West's economies are different. And they're different for a lot of reasons. And the way that we represent certain things in our economy. For instance, in parts of the Arab world, you meet somebody, you give some money to their family, and the wheels are greased and the transaction takes place. Now what happens here? What happens here is you hire the government relations or public relations firm that is paying the son of the family that owns the company or holds the cabinet ministry $500 an hour, pays the daughter of that family to give some legal advice that doesn't actually involve opening a law book or going to court. There are all kinds of systems. What we tend to do is we go to a greater effort to dress those things up as services, and as a result, there's greater accountability and greater visibility, and I think we do, there's no question that we get less corrupt economies here. But I think it's much more a question of how we label things and how we regulate things rather than are these things there or not.
Okay, let's go now to Ian on line 7. Hi, Ian, you're on the line.
Hello there, Christina. I have a question from your earlier segment with your two guests. First of all, I agree with them. It is misplaced compassion. The terrible crime this man committed, and he was working for Muammar Gaddafi at the time. But I have another question related to this. Is it possible that the British leadership, Tony Blair's successor and company, did this because for the last 25 to 35 years, millions and millions of people of the Muslim faith have emigrated to the British, to Europe in general, and that they're very political. Muslims they're very smart people. Trust me, I know they are, and I get along with everybody. It's just that they have a common goal in Europe is basically to gain more and more political power, and they are. And I think the leadership of Europe, especially England and France, are scared, and they've got a right to be scared because Sharia will become the new law within the next generation.
Okay, Ian, thanks for calling in. Do you want to respond to Ian's
just very briefly,
yes.
I think it's very important not to make generalizations about Muslims in Europe or Muslims anywhere. It's only, a fifth of the world's population. Chances are there's a good amount of diversity. But on top of that, I want to emphasize a lot of immigration from the Middle East, People are moving from Damascus to London because they want to live in London. They want to be part of a free, prosperous social order.
Yes.
And certainly, if you want to live in a place that has Sharia law, if you want to be in a place that privileges religion over freedom or prosperity, why on earth would you come to Europe? You would stay in a state that had Sharia law. And I think that it's important to recognize that in many ways, immigration is choosing the people from the Arab world, from the Muslim world, who have the greatest commitment to pluralism, freedom, and the values that they see the West as being able to offer them.
You've made some great distinctions there. We're going to go for a break. We'll be back after this. Don't go away. Hello again. Welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. Let's go now to you, Salah, on line 4. Hi, Salah. You're on the line.
Maybe I can shed some light on how these people in Libya feel when they receive the hello.
We're hearing you.
Oh yes, I think what we forget is I think in the West the West put different values in different lives. So yes, definitely the 277 that were killed in the Lockerbie bombing, it's tragedy, and if in fact this person is responsible, he should be executed. I have no doubt about that. But I think as one of your speakers and most people agree that the Iraqi war in specific was more about oil than anything else. and that is big oil companies in the West, and they agreed to make money. Okay. Now, as a result of this, we have a whole country destroyed, millions of people basically killed. I think 1.5 million babies killed and maimed and injured and all this. And then when we talk about Lockerbie, we identified the 277, and we grieve over them, and we say the killer should be held accountable, and. And where is the people who caused these millions of casualties?
Salah, thank you for calling in. Do you want to respond to that first, Robert?
Again, I think that's a frustration, and I heard it a bit from Stuart too, of not being able to solve every problem in the world just by addressing one at a time. And I think that's pretty much what you have to do. But I noticed the caller made an interesting comment in saying that the West has, quote, different values. And I think it's more than an issue of semantics to talk about, quote, pure this and that, because it's not purity we're talking about. It's simply the definition of what is good, what is bad, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And I would like to think murder is not acceptable. I would like to think the use of violence is not acceptable, except, of course, in self-defense and that kind of issue. But other than that, if you're going to argue as well that it's just about oil, and that the United States goes to war with countries over oil, well, their biggest oil trading partner is Canada. Is there some reason we're not at war with them? Or is there a difference in the relationship between our two countries? It's got nothing to do with oil.
To cut to the chase, and I want you to answer to this. I want you to answer to this,
nothing, but
Stuart.
it's not.
But the feeling that you get from, and we've gotten this from viewers calling in, that America has caused, okay, and this is, you hear this argument, the death of a lot of people abroad in the Middle East over oil, the war in Iraq over oil, that America is actually the big Satan, the big murderer, and when one of its own gets killed, there's a lot of crying, a lot of moral supremacy, but when somebody in the Middle East dies, nobody cares. That's what you hear, black and white in a sense. So when situations like this comes up, it validates that kind of a thinking against the West, if you want to phrase it that way. And I'd like you to reply to that. That's its purpose, you're saying, yes.
Well, I think that, first of all, to compare the Lockerbie bombing to war is really problematic because terrorism and war are not the same. And terrorist acts are murderous acts, especially in a situation like Lockerbie. Now, there are a lot of gray areas to do with guerrilla fighting, but to compare an invasion, a military invasion, is really problematic. Now, that said, the idea that countries don't go to war over commodities, that somehow a country can have such a good constitution it doesn't fight over commodities, is a little silly. Similarly, the idea that countries, if they go to war over a commodity once, will do it again and again, that's also unreasonable. What was going on in Iraq? Saddam Hussein was transferring British and American oil wells to France. Why did the French hate the war? Why did the British and Americans like the war? There were really specific local economic reasons. I'm not suggesting every war in the Middle East is about oil. Sometimes it's about supremacy, sometimes it's about genocide, sometimes it's about ethnic politics, sometimes it's about religion. But to suggest that, and to use your argument, to suggest that in a place where business and government are so very mixed together, that business would never try and send a government to war to carry out its interests.
Never ever suggested
it. Exactly. So you would recognize that that's just common sense, that when business and government are mixed, as they are in all countries in the world.
Business is not capitalism. You're confusing.
I'm not talking about capitalism right now. What I'm saying is that in your term, a mixed economy, where business and government are mixed together, one would expect that just as government acts to limit and constrain and structure and privilege certain businesses over others in a way that the free market would not, at the same time, those businesses exert real influence on government when it comes to diplomatic policy and when it comes to defense policy.
Well, sure they do, and so do all taxpayers and all people who vote.
And the idea that a megaphone can match a $100 million check, however, is a little,
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, Pima on line 7. Hi, Pima, you're on the line.
Hi. My comment is that the British has very much to do with the trade, because Gaddafi himself has stated that he has a deal with Gordon Brown. And my main contention is that last year they did it to Tibet, because British changed the 100-year policy on Tibet to gain $200 million of trade from China. So it is very much clear from word suzerainty to sovereignty that they changed it last year, the Beijing.
Did you pick up?
I didn't get all of that. I'm sorry. I understood that this is about trade, and I think that's a very helpful theme, that this is that trade involves a lot of handshaking and a lot of deals like this. It's one of the reasons
and that's
that
what starts disputes, is when a lot of handshaking and deals went on and somebody broke their end of the deal, and then the other guy wants to redress it. You don't even need to break your end
of the deal.
Not necessarily, but you know, that's the general what happens.
Okay, would the two of you be in agreement that when you look at this deal that supposedly took place between the Lockerbie bomber and the British government and business, that it was something disappointing that took place here?
Disappointing
it seems to be a
scarcely covers it.
Okay.
Disappointing scarcely covers it.
You agree on that point, I sense that, but is it surprising to you?
No.
No. It's been going on forever.
What surprises me, I said right at the beginning, is that it's a little sign that Muammar Gaddafi's relationship with his people is not that of the kind of dominant dictator that one would expect. I think that he's got to be looking over his shoulder at extremists within his army looking to take power the way he took power. He has got to be looking at the hinterland outside of Tripoli and looking at rural people who are probably getting an increasing portion of their social services through militias and other things as the Libyan state fails them. He's got to be in an insecure spot. And I think that the various desperate moves that he's made, both in terms of rapprochement with the West and with purchasing this very expensive symbol, indicates to me that we may see some instability in a corner of the Middle East where we've until recently only seen despotism and an iron fist.
Now, that's not surprising, but are you surprised that Britain would make that move, and particularly that Brown would try to somewhat cover it up by saying, "Be sensitive and how you handle the relationship."
About your point there.
Hang on a minute. Does that part? Hold that thought.
No,
does that part surprise you?
It's characteristic of Gordon Brown's government that Tony Blair could oil his way through anything. He could do his sleight of hand. He could make you watch this while this was going on. Gordon Brown is the exact opposite. Gordon Brown cannot keep anything a secret.
And when Gordon Brown tries to cover something, he had no backbone by trying to cover it up.
Well, but the point is, every cover-up by Gordon Brown is one you can see. He's the worst cover-up artist in the world. It's you know, he's like the last.
He's really got you fooled, and you're not looking at what he doesn't want you to.
That would be dangerous. That would be really scary.
That is a scary thought, and you may be
vindicated. Stuart, you mentioned something about the position in Libya being very uncertain and insecure, and all the leaders there have to look over their shoulders, which is exactly, I think, speaking to a point I made earlier about perhaps making a deal with the devil might not even be the right one. And so what scares me about the deal from, quote unquote, the West point of view is, why are they doing that then? Are they actually planning to prop somebody up? Are they planning to put a dictator in there that they know will hold power? So you can ask yourself a lot of questions in that regard. But again, I think at the heart of all of it comes it's issues of trade and issues that go wrong with trade that eventually cause disputes and wars and things like that. And I think oil is just one of many commodities. There's been wars fought over many commodities.
And
but
BP, according to this, is the biggest gainer.
Require a war.
And BP is a very diversified company, unlike a lot of oil companies. I think
oil is going to be much less of a commodity in the future when hydrogen takes over, and that's going to happen quicker than anybody thinks. And all those oil fields.
I watched the BC government sink a lot of money into battery power.
Do you believe that? You're an environmentalist. Do you believe that?
No. What I watched is a bunch of hydrogen white elephant technology come out of my hometown, and the head of Ballard Power ending up saying, well, actually what we really need is a breeder reactor in the trunk of everybody's car in order to make it work, or we need to run these fuel cells on natural gas. I mean, I hate not to be hopeful, because, you know, I'm a hopeful guy, but the hydrogen thing, it has too many recent boondoggles associated with it for me to take the next press release very seriously.
Before we go for a break, Dr. Tom on line 1. Hi, Dr. Tom, you're on the line.
Hi there. I think it's high time that people remember the true history of the Middle Eastern conflict. I personally saw Saddam Hussein on television, the Iraqi dictator, offering money to anyone who would kill Britons and Americans. As far as I'm concerned, that's a declaration of war. No further comment. Thanks.
Dr. Tom, thank you for calling in. We're going to go for a break now. We'll be back after this. Don't go away. Hello again, welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. Well, look at our second subject matter now up on your screen. Judges too old to rule, lawyers say. Well, that turned the federal court system into a tailspin. It screamed ageism, but when you look according to our Constitution, there is an age limit where these judges should be retiring, and that's 75. Well, all but one is over that age, and in fact, according to the article, a couple were appointed even after that age. Yes, we do live in a society where we're very much aware of discrimination when it comes to age, ageism and so forth, and I know there's a drive calling for retirement whenever, because that seems to be the way of the future, some say. But according to some proponents here, those lawyers, their judgment could be affected. We don't want to label every senior according to the same, paint them with the same brush, saying that when you get old, automatically you're going to decline in judgment. But we do know that cognition could be impaired in some way. 75 years old, first of all, let's break this into two parts. Do you think 75 is fair? And these judges, obviously, according to the Constitution, have gone above that. That's the second part to it. What should we be doing about that? Let's start with you on this one. First, Robert.
Is 75 fair? I think it's arbitrary, like a lot of ages are. but not based on total unreality. I mean, if we, same as picking 18 as the age of adult.
Yes.
You have to pick somewhere, although really, perhaps a better time would be when a person becomes independent.
Yeah, individual.
Now, at the other end of the scale, I have to tell you, I've known some 85-year-olds and 90-year-olds who make a 20-year-old look dumb. I mean,
I agree.
They're just fast on their feet like that. And so to me the case here is either change the law or change the judges, because you can't have both situations coexisting side by side. But if I'm not actually the expert to ask about whether 75 is the right age for making legal decisions and what kind of legal decisions, I would hope that the courts would notice that when a judge is losing his hang of what to, of who to hang, that maybe someone would notice and bring it to someone's attention. But I guess to get around that problem, you have a mandatory retirement age.
Well, the Constitution Act says 75. Do you think they should be? Do you think it should be dealt with according to the Constitution?
Or should there
Act?
even be a mandatory as such?
Well, that's one separate. That's one issue.
I think there's a bigger underlying issue here. It's why do we have age limits in certain situations? And I'll tell you, where I work, we have tenure at university. And much like judicial appointments, once you get tenure, you're unleashed and you're unaccountable. And when you have systems where people are unaccountable, and their judgment can then become impaired. I got to tell you, a friend of mine got a guy on a dissertation committee, and it's an amazing combination of what a severe stroke and tenure can do to wreak havoc in the academy. Now here, it's not because the person's hit 65, it's because they suffered massive irreparable brain damage. But they continue to be entitled to teach because it's a system with no accountability and no recall. And judicial appointments, like professorial appointments, I think are flawed in this way. I think that we wouldn't need retirement ages in some of these jobs where people can, in fact, continue getting better at them until the moment they die. And these ages will sometimes pull people out at the very peak of their career. But the reality is that we have some systems in our society where once somebody is accredited to do something, it doesn't matter how badly they screw up or how badly damaged they are, we can't stop them or pull them out. And I think that the judiciary, tenured professors, and certain other key jobs are like this, and what we really need to do is look at building a new methods of accountability into those systems so that we can start assessing people's ability rather than guessing it on the basis of their age.
Okay, let's go now to Ida on line 7. Hi, Ida, you're on the line.
Hi. Regarding this topic of judges, basically, I would suggest that we need to look at how they become accountable and performance-based as well. Basically, how do you find how do you define what's old? How do you define what is able?
Yes, Ida, that's a very good comment indeed. But there's a lawyer that said a comment in this particular article, a Toronto lawyer. She said, it's like driving. It's difficult for people to recognize when it's time to stop. Truth to that?
I highlighted that very statement, and I found I was thinking two ways about it. I don't think it's exactly like driving. I think driving is more a motor skill-oriented thing.
Also judgment, though, also cognition.
Yes.
And that was an article I wrote
But when
once.
you're driving, it depends on your speed and how fast you can arrive at a certain conclusion, whereas I imagine in a judge's chamber, you can take your time, go to precedent,
But you see,
like
the issue with seniors in driving, and this was something that I took it on the chin from some people, not all, in an article I wrote for Metro News, because I addressed the issue of senior driving. And the issue that I was taking isn't that there aren't driving tests, eye tests, and so on, but there are no tests available that will tell cognitive function. And the issue is there are many documented reports, public documentation, that seniors, and it's no offense to seniors, are a hazard on the road, and it's not because of their recklessness. That's not the issue. When you see that person racing down the road and cutting in and out of traffic, it's not going to be a senior. We all know that ad, you don't drive like her, okay? We know that ad. The problem is, these are the ones you might see going off on a one-way, reversing maybe on a ramp, or being in a certain lane, not realizing the havoc, driving under the speed limit that could be caused. There are definite problems and hazards related to this, according to public documentation. And I'm wondering here, could this be related? Because let's face it, the human nature, you don't want to give up power. You don't want to give up autonomy or ability. as the case may be.
Well, and also judgment. If judgment is what you use to determine if you have judgment. So it's a recursive thing. It's why when people develop paranoid schizophrenia, they may only intermittently notice, and the same is true of dementia. And that's just, it's an unfortunate characteristic of that problem. So I think that's why we need external regulation. Self-regulation is insufficient.
Okay, so would a regulation come in saying, well, when you hit 75, then you start getting tested?
No, I think you should start getting I think you should have to meet certain basic performance requirements all the time. I think that we tend to
comes back to accountability.
And that could be difficult. And that could be difficult because some judges will make a decision and you'll wonder what's wrong with them anyway.
All appointments should be contingent. I don't think anybody should be handed a lifetime appointment for any kind of job. I just think that's it's a bad way to run a culture. Everybody's appointment to their job should be reviewable because you don't know what could happen to a person to make them unqualified for a job they could once do.
I think of
CEOs are reviewable. I don't see why anybody else shouldn't.
We always hear, you know, doctors and teachers, for example. Both government monopolies are generally, quote, unquote, unaccountable, because it doesn't seem to be how bad or good they are, and that's because they've been severed from the marketplace. The accountability comes from the customer.
And we know with time...
people can choose to not go to doctors under this system. There's absolutely
Well, we're going to be having more discussions about this in the near future as that gap continues with the baby boomers. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
And that's all the time we have. See you again next time. I'm Christine Williams, and from all of us, thank you for watching.